All right, well, hello and welcome. Hopefully we're having a great start to our Tuesday here. And so I will start. I know I have a few people that will be joining us, hopefully, in the next few minutes. Again, welcome, and hopefully we're having a super day. And so you can see on our agenda on the Google slide here, in a moment, I'm going to put a link to a Google poll in the chat, and I'm hoping that you'll respond. And I would like for you to respond to it. And then got a little video clip here on stormy weather. It's going to focus a little bit on critics, and then look at our assignment that's for today that's dealing with the critics as well. Now, to go with our theme that I had talked about yesterday of Black history, I do want to spotlight a little bit here on Black history and focusing on Black history in regards to the Great Depression. And yesterday I had mentioned an artist, Jacob Lawrence, and that he had been a member of a group known as the Harlem Artists Guild. And I kind of like hastily just put it in there. So I want to take a moment to kind of spotlight this group because it's a very interesting group, influential, short amount of time, but still very, very influential. And you might have perhaps remembered from the earlier trimester, near the end of it with the impact of Reconstruction and looking at perhaps some positives for the African American community in this idea of the emergence of what is known as the Harlem Renaissance. Well, that is going on, and that's a product of migration, and it's a product of people coming to places like New York City, and cultural movements emerge, and what people tend to refer to as the Harlem Renaissance. Well, you have this Harlem Artists Guild, and it was formed in 1935 by a group of African American artists. They met in the Harlem Community Arts Center, so that's kind of like their home base. And really what they wanted to focus on is a guild, all right? And a guild is an old kind of like, we can say medieval Renaissance word, but we're looking at a group that really is looking at nurturing for a common good. So encourage young talent artists, provide a forum for discussion of visual arts, foster an art and an appreciation of art, focus on issues such as racism, poverty, and unemployment. And so artists look at their medium as a platform to take on these issues. So there's a social justice element to it. Work with agencies to improve conditions and raise standards of living and achievements among African American artists. And so looking at those artists and finding a way to bring them along, improve the standard of living, and get them to be known and showcase their works. And so on the wall of a museum, you have a variety of artists, not just an artist representing one particular group. And so the Harlem Artists Guild will have about 90 artists as members. And so some of them are known and others are not. But still, it's a collective group during the Great Depression, trying again to promote African American artists, and whether they're sculptors or painters or muralists. But again, something, an organization to look out for their needs. And so one can look at the Harlem Artists Guild here as a pressure group. And this, and sometimes they're referred to as HoA, pressured the Federal Arts Project of the WPA. So that's one of those New Deal programs And in many of these programs, there are um, agencies underneath them, like the Federal Arts Project, to accept more African American artists, right? So this is where we can look at some shortcomings of some of the New Deal programs. And the Guild was successful in lobbying the WPA on behalf of many African American artists. So the painters and the muralists and the sculptors. And so they promoted African American culture and themes. And so part of the Guild, they had a kind of we'll say, an organization constitution, and part of it is their charge or their preamble. And so it says, "We, the artists of Harlem, being aware of the need to act collectively in the solution of cultural, economic, social, and professional problems that confront us, do hereby constitute ourselves an organization that shall be known as Harlem Artists Guild." All right, so that's their preamble, that's their charge. And again, from 1935 to 1941, they really focused on that. And then, artists started to move on to other projects. It's also World War II is starting, and so people are starting to be drawn in different directions, but still, for a very short period of time, very, very influential. And so August Savage and Charles Alston would be would be a couple of the founders of this guild. And it's through their guidance and their mentorship that other artists are going to be brought along, included, and get the benefit of being part of some of these New Deal art projects. Jacob Lawrence, again here, he went from individuals to focusing more on collective group here, and the migration series is emphasizing the Great Migration that had occurred after Reconstruction up to about the 1920s and 30s. And then you have the mural called Pursuit of Happiness that would be found in the Harlem Hospital, and it's done by a series of artists as well. So there we go. The Harlem Artists Guild. All right. Anyone have any comments or questions? All right. Okay, so I'm putting in the chat this Google form, and please click on that link, and I will show you what it looks like here when you open it up. All right, it's going to look something like this. So take a moment here. Please fill it out. It's just simply getting you to answer the question. Is FDR using the New Deal to overhaul or overthrow? Is FDR using the New Deal to overhaul or overthrow? And so when we talk about overhaul, fix or tweak the economic system, or overthrow, which means replace the economic system with a new system. Okay, and part of that can go into your frame of thinking is maybe political philosophy. All right, so let's take a moment here. Please do that. We got about 24 students in class, so I'm hoping to see high numbers here. All right, let's get those numbers going. All right. All right, let's see if we get that number just a little bit higher. I'm a little greedy. All right. So it looks like I got most of you to participate, which is fantastic. But overall, it does look like, um, you know, about 66.7% or 67% of those who are responding think that FDR is overhauling the system, where 33.3% or a third of the class is saying otherwise, that it's an overthrow. So if we think it's an overthrow, what could be one reason that could lead us to think that? All right, unmute or put into the chat. One reason you think that it might be viewed as an overthrow. All right, well, we're thinking about that one. What could be one reason why we think FDR is just simply overhauling the system? How about that? Let's go with that one. Either unmute or just put into the chat your thought.
One thing that happened is with a lot of policies, I think it's called SEC, I think it was, for an example, it was more overhauling and protecting the system rather than just outright replacing it. It was more built to protect the stock market.
Okay, so Zach, I think you're referring to is the SEC, the Security Exchange Commission, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, yep, okay. So again, tweak it. Okay. And so when we look at, he introduced many new organizations that changed how our economic system worked completely. Would that be viewed as a way he overthrew the system? I think you could look at it perhaps as that, because it's swinging the United States in a new direction, one in which perhaps made some people uncomfortable. And once you go in a certain direction, and that momentum that goes with it, it can be a little difficult to go back. And so in difficult times, big strides were gained to go in one direction. In times of when things are good, now going back, but maybe not. So I think perhaps maybe the new organizations and all that stuff maybe is an example of overthrow. Okay. All right. So got a few things there as well. But when you look at all these different programs, you know, we talk about the New Deal, and it's based on 3 R's: relief, recovery, reform. It gives the impression that it is a well thought out, coherent policy, but one could make a claim that it wasn't, and that with the hundreds of agencies that are being created here and the amount of the legislation that's being passed, it does kind of give that let's just go with it, let's experiment, see if it works, and if it does, great. If it don't, let's try it again type approach here. Now, a problem is with the New Deal is not everyone is included in some of the programs as expressed by the Harlem Artists Guild, or some would say who's bearing the burden to these types of programs. Someone's got to pay the bill. So who bears the burden here for these new programs? And how long will these programs last? Now, we know there are several of these programs that are still with us today. FDIC is an example. SEC is another example. Social Security is another example. All right, so we have some examples of these programs still sticking with us. All right, so did the New Deal go too far or not far enough? And so this is where we can speak of to maybe some of the criticism of the New Deal here. And so I have a video clip that we'll see. It's part of that earlier video clip I had showed, and it's going to highlight some of the criticism of the New Deal, and then we'll go from there into our assignment. Okay, so give me a moment here to bring up my video clip. All right, so we're going to watch, I'd say, about 7 minutes of a video clip here, and it's going to focus on some of the criticism of FDR and his New Deal program, and some of the reasons why they criticize it. And so think about some takeaways that you might have with this particular clip.
Longshoremen won virtually all their demands, encouraging workers across the country to move against management. In 1934, there were more than 1,800 strikes for union recognition.
Coal mine, steam worker. Yeah, different packing out. They said if a bunch of starving seamen and longshoremen could weather the storm, and we could do it back in Pittsburgh, or we could do it here, we could do it there.
Labor unrest was only one of Roosevelt's problems in 1934. Economic recovery had stalled, and critics complained that he'd gone too far. The constitutionality of some New Deal programs were being challenged in the courts, and business leaders were warning that FDR had steered the country recklessly to the left. But Roosevelt knew that his program still hadn't reached millions of desperate Americans, and he didn't know how long they would wait. Discontent and frustration gave rise to any number of demagogues, including the charismatic radio priest Father Charles Coughlin, Dr. Francis Townsend, self-proclaimed advocate for the elderly, radical spellbinders who claimed the New Deal was dying. During 1934, one of these would-be saviors developed a national following and presidential ambitions. He was called the Kingfish, Senator and former Louisiana Governor Huey Long.
After we told you people Hoover was a non-go,
name that you had was when Huey came to town to speak.
they put it in to plow up every third row of cotton.
Everybody went to hear him, whether they were for him or against him. He was marvelous.
The Lord has answered the prayer. He has called the barbecue.
He used such expressive language.
He said the
You just had to listen.
155 million Americans.
And when people listened, many discovered they liked what they heard.
What Huey Long was saying was that he was going to soak the rich and he was going to give that money to the poor. His plan was never really carefully worked out, and in his own state in Louisiana, he fell notably short of redistributing the wealth. But it had a kind of direct appeal that the more complex programs of the New Deal lacked, and also provided a focus for the animus against the rich that had been building during the years of the Great Depression.
Long promised every American a house, a car, a radio. In return, he wanted power. Absolute power.
You couldn't do anything in Louisiana unless you got his okay. He was vicious. And if you told him no, he'd knock you down.
He had built up a private police force. He had shown his contempt for the democratic processes, and that created a great deal of worry in Washington.
Not just Southerners, but Midwestern farmers and New York factory workers were joining Long Share Our Wealth clubs. By 1935, Franklin Roosevelt was privately calling Huey Long the most dangerous man in America.
They sat up and called General Hugh S. Johnson down here to take charge of that.
When you have food riots, you have the makings of a dictatorship. Don't think you wouldn't do it too. You might vote the wrong way. He rose on the votes of the people, and Huey Long was rising on the votes of the people too.
Huey Long never got the chance to run for president. He was cut down by an assassin in September 1905. By then, President Roosevelt was hard at work on a populist agenda of his own, pushing Congress to create the Social Security programs, welfare for the poor, and jobs for 8 million people on public projects of every description. This was called the Second 100 Days, and it reshaped American life.
The legislation of the second 100 days gives an underpinning to the economy that's not been there before. There's now a system of unemployment compensation, of old age pensions. The United States, for the first time, has a centralized banking system. And by 1936, there are visible signs of recovery.
Okay, so there we go. Any immediate reactions or thoughts about that video clip here, about any of the individuals or anything that they were talking about? Anything that could spark as a takeaway? I mean, for me, I always think there's some good historical nuggets in that, just in that little video clip there. This idea of a general strike in 1934, I had mentioned that in Minneapolis, there'll be a general strike as well. I refer to it as a trucker strike, but it also had some other groups in there as well. There is a garment company in Minneapolis as well, and the women participated in this general strike as well. Huey Long, almost like a pre-Hitler. Well, you know, this is the time. This is the 1930s. I mean, we got authoritarians out there. Adolf Hitler is there, and Benito Mussolini, and so I think, you know, the one lady from Louisiana was kind of alluding to it. You know, be careful who you vote for. You know, you may vote the wrong way. Huey Long fits in the category that we call a demagogue, someone, a political leader who speaks and has an appeal, and he picked up on the emotion of what people are expressing at the time, but that's really about it. He didn't get a chance really to bring it national, one would say, because he does get assassinated. He did have some influence in the Midwest and in the South. And so the idea of share our wealth is he's going to take from the rich and he's going to give the poor. And it looks good, and he wants the power. And so that's the danger that goes with it. Now, some of these other critics, though, they will have an agenda, and it might find their way into some brand of New Deal legislation. Now, here in Minnesota, we don't necessarily follow the trend in politics at this time as well. There's a lot that is talked about how Minnesota hasn't voted Democrat since the 1972 election with Richard Nixon. But at this time period, in the 1930s, our governor of the state of Minnesota, Floyd Olson, actually belonged to a political party known as the Farmer Labor Party. The Farmer Labor Party was a dominant party. You had the Republicans, you had the Farmer Labor, and then you also had the Democrats. Floyd Olson was very popular, and he was a progressive governor during the 1930s. During that strike, even though he may sympathize with the strikers, he does send in the National Guard and declares martial law in Minneapolis during that time. And then by 1940, though, the Farmer Labor Party will merge with the Democratic Party in Minnesota, which becomes known as the DFL. So sometimes when you look on political signs in Minnesota, you might see the initials DFL, and that just signifies the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. Gavin, you got a question?
Isn't our current governor part of the DFL party?
Say that again?
Isn't our current governor part of the DFL party?
Floyd Olson? No.
I'm
But
talking about like Tim Walz.
Our current governor is DFL, yes.
Yeah, I'm talking about Tim Walz.
Yep, Governor Walz is. Yep, he is. And before in Minnesota, our Republicans, it was more in the 1960s and 70s. They had actually referred to themselves as independent Republicans. They had some differences with the National Republican Party, and they wanted to act a little bit more independent. And so, but today they're not necessarily referred to as the IR. But in my day, when I was your age, it was referred to as the IR. So times would dictate changes in political philosophy and all that stuff. Okay. Really, the purpose of that clip was to highlight that there are some critics of the New Deal, that we can't just walk away thinking that the New Deal is all that in a bag of chips. That because FDR got elected in a landslide in 1932, as well as in 1936, it doesn't necessarily mean that he has a free hand in doing what he wants. People generally like the direction. And so by 1936, like the video clip had said, it looks like we are improving, but we still have high unemployment in 1936. But the most important thing I think that clip was going to try to get at, if we would have watched it a little bit longer, is how people felt. If people feel better, well, they're gonna stick with the game plan, and they stuck with the game plan with FDR. All right, so hopefully you're in Schoology, and hopefully you'll have called this up. We're looking at the critics of the New Deal, and what we want to look is we want to understand the opposing views of the New Deal, and these opposing views are going to come from both sides of the spectrum. All right, some are going to come from the right. Some are going to come from the left side of the spectrum as well, because they're going to say, FDR, you've gone way too far, or FDR, you haven't gone far enough. And they have some ideas that FDR needs to take into consideration. So if you open it up there's two parts really here, or two aspects, two attachments. There we go, to your assignment. You have the expectation sheet, and then you also have the reading. You're going to want to have them both together. So in Notability, merge them together, and you'll submit them together, because on one part of it, you're going to do a little guided reading here, a little marking up the text, and then a little marking up the text, and then answer some questions based on what you just had done with the text. All right. And so in 1933, we see that some voices of protest against FDR programs were occurring. But the time went on, and more people rose in opposition to Roosevelt and his efforts. Just like any president, the longer they're in office, they are going to be more subjected to criticism. And so some argued he didn't go far enough. Others insisted he did. And so that's why they look at him as a socialist and maybe a communist sympathizer. And he may have had some of those individuals in his administration. By 1936, many FDR critics were wondering if FDR's intentions were making matters worse, not better. Some insisted strongly that the New Deal was a failure. And you can make a claim to that. And then by 1937, we do slip into a recession because he pulls back some of that spending here. All right. Still, though, he did win the 1936 election by a landslide, big time. All right, so what I want you to do with that reading, you want to look at the critics of the New Deal. And again, it's not that long of a reading. All right, we're looking about 6 pages. And to me, I look at it, it's not that long of a reading. And what you do is, as you read, please highlight the different critics. Come up with a color. All right, I got yellow here. You just come up with a different color. Just highlight critics. All right, and you can usually see that by looking at the section headings, or the subsection headings can highlight the critics. And then also in a different color, highlight their reasoning. Why didn't they like the New Deal? And also highlight in a different color a suggestion, if they presented a suggestion. All right. You can critique. You can say it's a bad thing, but what's your plan to fix it? All right. If you think that we need to have some type of Social Security, what's it look like? All right. If we need to look at our banking, what's your solution? Okay. And so first part of this is marking up the text. Second part is you got 2 historical questions that I want you to look at. Once you get done with your marking up text, reflect on it, and then how great of a threat were the critics of FDR's New Deal? All right. So we might have been in shock and awe with Huey Long, but really, how great of a threat were these critics? Okay, and threat could be taking power, taking away, taking down the system, threatening perhaps FDR's New Deal. A lot of interpretation go into that. And then how much of an impact do you think the opposition had on FDR's approach to the Great Depression? And justify your answer. Did these critics and somehow cause FDR to pause for a moment and say, boy, that's a great point, need to include it? Or I hear your point, but I'm not going to include it. So how much did the opposition have that could have changed FDR's approach? Okay. Any questions or concerns about this assignment and what you have to do? Okay. If you don't have any questions, you are free to go and leave, or you can stay on the Google Meet to work on this assignment and or ask questions.